saying that art has been stolen across the world and for centuries by victors of war and by colonial powers and on a worldwide basis. Some, like the Taliban, destroy images of art because they consider it hostile to their own worldviews. It's a terrible loss. In modern times, we've seen claims of recovery in many spheres, some for culture, some for economic gain, but often unsuccessful. Just this morning's paper, the New York Times, I'll just hold this up. There's a story, I'll just read the headlines. It's Germany to return art stolen in 1897 to Nigeria. So that's a hopeful story that, after so many, unachieved efforts to reclaim, perhaps we're seeing a new consciousness in those who plundered. To me, Nazi looted art represents something else. And I'm not sure what that is, and we can pursue that and explore that together. If you look for stories about plundered art, there are just a gazillion sources. And just the other day, I looked through the New York Times archive and just some recent ones. In January of 2021, there's a story about a rare violin not returned to a Jewish music dealer. In January of 2020, Poland was urged to look for Nazi-looted art in their museums. In January 2019, there was a story about Hitler looted the art, then they looted Hitler, restolen by desperate Germans at the closing days of the war. So that's a very mixed bag of motives. So, Jerry, I'm going to ask you if you would put into view the Klimt painting.
Thank you.
Okay, just a screenshot that I took. There's a little bit more in the bottom. It's the best I could capture for something that looked, sufficiently detailed. We've seen movies about art recovery with dramatic court scenes. This is the famous story about the woman in gold, about a Klimt painting. There's also been an interesting movie about the U.S. military rescuing stolen art in this movie called The Monument Men. An account given of thousands of other artworks, some still being withheld by museums and private collections. So, and you could see that sometimes it's a matter of which country or which museum. The Netherlands has been resistant, Poland has been resistant. And there was a story just the other day, and it wasn't involving art, but it was the grandfather of somebody's whose apartment house was stolen in Poland, I think it was, finally succeeded in getting a court ruling. This is 3 generations later, but it wasn't clear to me what the final outcome was, but he finally started meeting the occupants of this building that the order would have ordered them to be evicted in. I mean, you think about all of the complex dilemmas of human life. So what I want to do is to start with a video. No, before that, excuse me. I just want to talk a little bit more about the one film. I wanted to give a brief synopsis of the Lady in Gold movie. The film is based on a true story by Maria Altman, an elderly Jewish refugee living in Kehilat Hills, Los Angeles, who together with her young lawyer, Randy Schoenberg, fought the government of Austria for almost a decade to reclaim Klimt's iconic painting of her aunt, Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. The story represents a series of similar efforts that were not successful. Now, in June of 2006, cosmetic magnate Ronald Lauder purchased the portrait of Adele Blocher for $135 million. Then the highest price ever paid for a painting, and displayed it in the museum, the Noy Gallery, at a sale brokered at Christie's. Sharon and I did go to the Noy Gallery, saw it, and saw other Klimt's work. I attended a presentation of Klimt's work on Zoom during the past year, and I saw maybe 6 or 8 paintings that I've never seen before, all of brides and family members. Klimt himself was not Jewish, but Klimt found patronage. In fact, because amongst wealthy Jewish families, and because of that, he was shunned, by the non-Jewish world and the Germans and the Austrians. I'm not sure which, but he managed to make a living because there were enough rich Jews. And to see these paintings, they were as dazzling as The Woman in Gold, but different and very creative. So you have a chance to see all those different bride paintings. They're just magnificent. So I wanted to start with a first video, and it was just 10 minutes and done by PBS News. And let's run that now.
I'll be right back.
Simon Goodman has spent 20 years searching for his family's art collection looted by the Nazis in World War II. Much of the art, taken from Jewish families, was intended to stock Adolf Hitler's planned museum in Linz, Austria. Goodman's grandfather, Fritz, was a wealthy Dutch banker who amassed a great art collection with his wife, Louise.
He had at least 60 old masters, some of them very important, some impressionists.
After the Nazis occupied the Netherlands, Hitler's art agents forced Fritz and Louise to sell, telling them if they did, they would survive.
They take everything, starting with the old masters all the way down to the china teacups. The trick was that they would be given a train ticket to Italy, and that train ticket ended up taking them to a concentration camp instead.
Goodman's grandparents were killed in the camps. His father, Bernard, living in England, survived the war, got married, and had Simon and his brother Nick. Bernard traveled frequently to look for the missing art. Some resurfaced in the Netherlands, but it was a fight to get it back.
The Dutch government didn't consider a forced sale to be any kind of extenuating circumstances. They said it's still a sale, you complied, you signed this contract.
After Bernard died in 1994, boxes of his papers arrived at Simon's doorstep in Los Angeles. As Simon recounts in his new memoir, The Orpheus Clock, a reference to a piece that he eventually recovered, his father's quest became his own. One of the most important pieces of evidence that was in your father's papers was an envelope with 3 black and white slides.
Yes.
What did that show?
I held them up to the light. They were obviously French Impressionist paintings. So we had them blown up, and then we started asking around. I mean, one I could clearly see was by Edgar Degas.
This 1890 Degas landscape was a painting his grandparents were forced to sell. Simon first saw a color image of it in a book at UCLA Library in 1995.
Really, my life changes at that point.
The collector who had purchased the Degas had donated it to the Art Institute of Chicago. Simon and his brother sued, and in 1998 were named the rightful owners. They agreed to split the value of the painting with the collector, and the museum bought out their half. The successful claim was the first case of its kind in the US, and many more have followed, for them and for other families, in other museums, and in other countries.
It's like a forensic job. You're trying to piece together the ownership history of paintings.
Lucian Simmons' job is to check artworks offered to Sotheby's auction house and weed out any with a tainted past. by checking documents, physically examining the art, and checking databases of missing works.
That process is designed to ascertain whether or not the painting could have been in, if you like, the wrong place at the wrong time, could have been in continental Europe between 1933 and 1945, and could have been stolen. Once in a blue moon, we find a picture which was with a bad person, somebody who's a red flag.
So I guess the easy ones to reject are the ones that have been reported stolen in the art loss register and similar databases.
We wouldn't reject them. What we do is to say to our consignor, our client, look, we have a problem here. Let's now sit down together and try and work out if we can bring about a resolution.
I imagine the reaction is, you've got to be kidding me. I paid good money for this. I did nothing wrong. I have a legal bill of sale. Is that typical?
It's a typical reaction, or people say, I never knew. I inherited this from my grandmother. It's a shock, but my job is to actually talk people off the ledge and then try and make it in from a bad story into a good story.
Simmons and Sotheby's were able to turn a bad story into a good story by selling this Paris street scene by French Impressionist Camille Pissarro. The painting had belonged to a German Jewish businessman killed in the Holocaust. When the painting resurfaced in the Israel Museum 60 years later, the family made a claim. The museum returned it to the family, who took it to Sotheby's, who sold it for $31 million in 2014. Museums are often caught in the middle.
Before we buy a work of art, we do as much research as we can.
Eric Lee is director of the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. After a flurry of looted art claims, 15 years ago, American museums adopted guidelines telling them how to handle Nazi looted art.
It's an ongoing process, but there are always gaps. And rarely do you have a history of complete ownership of a work of art from the time it was created until today.
The Kimball decided to review everything and be transparent, posting online the ownership histories called the provenance. Sometimes this process meant reckoning with uncomfortable truths. This canvas by 19th century British painter Joseph Turner hung in the museum for 40 years. In 2006, a family came forward with proof the painting was looted from them. The Kimball returned it and then repurchased it at auction for $6 million, a big price for doing the right thing. And then it happened again.
It's a sculpture of extremely high quality of a very beautiful woman from the Italian Renaissance.
In 2011, Lee was shown this photograph of the sculpture in the hands of a special Allied Army unit dedicated to post-war art recovery, the Monuments Men, who found it stashed with Nazi loot in an Austrian salt mine.
I was completely floored by this. We had no idea that the sculpture had been taken by the Nazis.
Because the sculpture was returned after the war to the rightful owners before being resold, the Kimball got to keep it. The latest looted art case to be settled in the U.S. involved the University of Oklahoma.
Hit me right between the eyes the minute I learned of this.
What University President David Boren learned about in 2012 was that there was a problem with the gift of 30 paintings bequeathed to the school by a prominent Oklahoma family 12 years earlier. Among them was this Pissarro painting of a shepherdess. After the war, it traveled from France to Switzerland, the Netherlands, and New York, where a gallery sold it to the Oklahoma family in 1956. Just 4 years ago, the heir of a Jewish couple whose collection was looted during the Nazi occupation of France said the Pissarro was hers. Then she sued the university in federal court to get it back.
So we were confronted with a very difficult situation. A very generous donor who in good faith gave us this art, and another family that clearly had this art stolen from them by the Nazis.
Last month, the university settled the case, ceding title or ownership to the French claimant and agreeing to share its public display, a few years in Paris, then a few years in Oklahoma, and back again.
It's an ethical and moral issue, not just a legal issue. We weren't about to try to compromise our ethics in order to continue to build collections.
Claudia Schaum's family never had a big collection, but her grandparents bought some paintings in New York in the 1920s and 30s. Decades later, her parents inherited them, including this small picture of a man and a wife weighing gold by a 17th century Dutch artist. It hung in the Manhattan apartment where Schaum grew up.
I remember exactly where it was, passed by every day.
When her father died in 2011, Schaum and her siblings tried to sell it along with other paintings he owned. Sotheby's auctioned 5 of them, but declined to sell the Dutch painting, which had been appraised at $400,000. The red flag? A Nazi officer named Menton once possessed it. Schaum was unable to prove it was never stolen.
Sotheby's just said full stop, out, we're not touching it. And their recommendation at the time was just have a family member hang it on their wall, because that's just all that's ever going to happen to this painting.
It's tainted.
Yeah, exactly.
In the past year, Schaum gave up. Today, it hangs in her brother's home. Ironically, the notoriety of being looted can add value to an artwork.
It's a rare picture. It's in beautiful condition.
Yeah,
Since Lucien Simmons started his job at Sotheby's 21 years ago, the auction house has cleared and sold $800 million of once looted art.
They used to say, don't mention this difficult history of a painting. People won't want to know that this belonged maybe to a Nazi or was stolen from a Jewish family. But now people have gone the other way, and they actually want to hear the story. They want to hear the background of the painting.
Next month, Sotheby's will auction this painting from 1660 by the Dutch artist Gabriel Metsu. It belonged to the Rothschild family in Vienna until the Nazis took it in 1938 and hung it in Hitler's residence in Munich. The monuments men found it after the war with the Nazi inventory number on the back.
Hans Clark's in the museum marked this AR, this is Alphonse von Rothschild, 857.
A story that is part of the marketing of a painting estimated to be worth $6 to $8 million.
Provenance is certainly going to add to its rarity and add to its appeal.
Hitler's museum never got built, but tens of thousands of artworks stolen in his name are unaccounted for. Simon Goodman is still searching. He currently has a claim against the Boymans Museum in Rotterdam for these hand-painted Renaissance-era dishes. Only recently did Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum return his family's 500-year-old silver and gold pitcher and these 17th century Chinese vases. Are you doing this for the money?
The money is important because it's my delayed inheritance. It's my family's heritage. These are our belongings. But my primary motivation is, as long as these things are out there that belong to my family, and it's my duty to get them back, because otherwise, in a way, Hitler won.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jerry. We will be viewing one more, but I'm particularly struck by the idea of Hitler's Planned Museum. I'm also recalling a time when Sharon and I visited Prague, and I remember reading the history of Prague and seeing all those beautiful buildings. For those who've been there, say, how did this survive the war? Well, what I read was, as I recall, Hitler put Prague off limits because he had Prague intended as a preserved city of the disappeared. Again, a very heinous kind of idea to do that. The next video is 13 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. We'll pose some questions. I want you to ask questions. We'll have a discussion. But the next video is done by a Cambridge historian, Sir Richard Evans, on looting in the Nazi era.
Well, I've always worked on modern German history, 19th and 20th century. And I worked in particular on the history of Nazi Germany. I produced a book on the historiography of Nazi Germany in the 1980s, and work on the Irving trial, which is a defamation action brought over allegations of Holocaust denial. I was working on that in the late 1990s, and then I produced a 3-volume history of Nazi Germany in the years 2003 to 2008. Well, in the 1990s, following the fall of the Berlin Wall, the issue of reparations and restitution became very central to the way that we deal with the legacy of Nazi Germany. It's partly because there were a lot of claims for restitution of property seized by the East German government after 1949, and partly because there were claims for compensation by Eastern European slave laborers in Nazi Germany who are now, with the fall of communism, able to make their claims. And so that led on in the 1990s to the issue of reparation and restitution in terms of artworks of one kind and another. And as the claims started to come in, the British government under Tony Blair felt it was necessary to set up a panel which would adjudicate on these claims, not in a legal sense, but in a moral sense, because legally the statutes of limitation mean that the legal claims for almost all of these claims have expired. So that panel was constituted at the beginning of the present century, and it was set up with a number of different experts. There was an art dealer, philosopher to give us moral guidance, as a former civil servant. There was a couple of lawyers, and I was put on it as the historian. And it's called the spoliation panel because it's not just a case of the Gestapo coming into somebody's house and taking all the pictures off the walls and working away with them, though we have dealt with cases like that. But there are more subtle forms of looting as well. For example, forcing Jewish families to sell their artworks at an undervalue in the 1930s by imposing extra tax burdens on them when they're not really justified, for example.
I think it's worth considering that the panel is trying to make sense of events that happened now sort of probably 70 years ago, and an expression which you'll often find in the panel's reports are the panel considered or took the view based on the balance of probabilities. So actually having someone who understands the sort of the events and the history and the laws of the time has been really, really helpful, and has certainly helped the panel towards reaching a decision in many of their cases.
It was initially expected to actually, nobody told us, or I might not have joined the panel, that there would be hundreds, if not thousands of claims. And if that had been the case, then we'd have been working more or less full time. But in fact, there's only been a trickle, maybe a couple every year. And that, I think, has got a number of reasons. Firstly, there's a huge restitution action at the end of the Second World War, led by the famous monuments man, the Museum and Fine Arts Authority in the American Army, with British involvement in that. And that restored thousands and thousands of artworks to their original owners. And then very often the trail has gone cold after more than half a century. The evidence is very thin. Where the evidence is extremely strong, it was usually restitution at the end of the Second World War by the early 1950s. And then, of course, many families were murdered. Then, of course, many families were murdered in Auschwitz and elsewhere. There's simply nobody left to claim the artwork. So I think for all these reasons, there was a long period of inactivity in the field. And in fact, it only began again with a much greater interest that's been in the Holocaust in the 1990s, with films like Spielberg's Schindler's List, for example, and a great deal of publicity given to these issues.
In the case of the coronation of the Virgin oil sketch, Sir Richard Evans was able to offer some very helpful insights for the benefit of the panel. The issue before the panel at the time was whether the debts that had been incurred by the owner, which led to the sale of his art collection, had been fabricated, whether they were fabricated tax demands by the Nazi authorities, or whether they were as a result of bad investments. And Sir Richard Evans' knowledge of the sort of developments in the German banking system at that time, the financial crisis in, I think, 1931 and 32, and the sort of general Aryanization of the banking system at that time, and how that affected employees and directors in the banks, because I seem to remember this person lost their job as well. And I remember there was some comparison of how those policies had impacted on other organisations and banks at the time, and Richard Evans' understanding of the, as I say, of the history of what was happening in Germany at that time was instrumental in allowing the panel to reach its sort of very firm and clear conclusion.
This oil sketch by Peter Paul Rubens was made for the Jesuit church in Antwerp in a series of paintings on the ceiling depicting the Old and New Testament. It was made sometime before 1613, and it represents an initial sketch for the coronation of the Virgin. And one can see its octagonal shape, reflecting the frame that it would have. The ceiling paintings were perished in a fire in the 18th century, and so these sketches become all the more important in the history of that commission. The Samuel Courtauld Trust referred the claim for restitution of the coronation of the Virgin to the Spoliation Advisory Panel, and it was not the first time the Samuel Courtauld Trust referred a case to the panel. And in this particular case, the facts of the story were so extraordinarily complex and had to do with banking history in the 1930s, before the arrival of the Nazis, as well as through, in relation to the Dresdner Bank and the head of the Dresdner Bank, who was in fact the former owner of this painting. And on the face of it, the case appeared rather condemning, but upon a great deal of research and forensic examination by an expert witness who the Samuel Courtauld Trust employed to look into the facts of the story, and in thanks to the panel's openness and enabling the dialogue and the conversation, the dialogue between the claimants and ourselves, this allowed for a very full discussion to come out. And it is obviously thanks to the panel's recommendation that the Samuel Courtauld Trust was able to keep this work in its collection and put it on display for the public.
Well, we also had a very unusual claim, which was from the Archbishop of Benevento, which is in southern Italy, not far from Naples, for the return of a missal. That's a 12th century manuscript written in a rather beautiful script called Beneventan minuscule. So it has a very close association with the area. And this was in the British Library, formerly in the British Museum before the two were split. And it was purchased just after the end of the war from a British officer. So it wasn't actually owned by a Jewish family, it was owned by an Italian monastery. And it wasn't taken by the Nazis, it was taken by a British officer. And so we decided in the end that because the terms of reference of the panel simply referred to the Nazi era, we had to deal with this. And after a great deal of investigation and debate and an oral hearing, we decided that it had been in the possession of the monastery in 1944. It had most likely literally fallen off the back of a lorry as they piled all their possessions onto lorries and drove away while the fighting was coming up Italy towards them. And it found its way into a Naples bookshop where it was bought by a British Army officer and sent by post to Britain. And he then offered it to the British Museum. And crucially, really, the British Museum wrote to him saying they suspected it had been looted and couldn't accept it directly from him. But they said that he should offer it for auction through a reputable house like Sotheby's or Christie's. And they then felt able to purchase it themselves. So they had a very, very strong feeling that it was looted, and we concluded that that was correct.
Following a private member's bill in Parliament, the Holocaust Return of Cultural Objects Act was introduced and became an Act of Parliament in 2009, which allowed all national museums, including the British Library, to return items where this followed a recommendation by the panel and ministers agreed. So in fact, I think it was in 2010, the British Library referred the case back to the panel. And because the panel had sort of considered this before and the conclusion was quite clear, using that act of parliament, the missile was returned to Italy. And that was the Benevento missile was the first item returned under the Holocaust Return of Cultural Objects Act.
So we decided that we wanted to put forward a bill which would enable us to recommend restitution and that recommendation to be followed, rather than institutions saying, well, we'd love to, but we can't do it because of our statutes. So we drew up a sort of rough shopping list of what we wanted, and then it went into the civil service, and the drafting, it went into the civil service for drafting, and they, of course, came up with all sorts of possible problems that the legislation might lead to, which in the end didn't seem to be insuperable. One problem was that we tried to put it on to a government bill, just to tack it on as a clause, as quite frequently done. But first of all, there were timetabling problems. The government legislative program is always subject to alterations if very urgent things come in and so on. So it was very uncertain, and we wanted to do this fairly quickly. And then secondly, you can amend government bills, and the Elgin Marbles lobby got hold of this and said they would amend it to include the Elgin Marbles, go right back to the early 19th century. And the government was very keen to avoid that. So we found a private member, and you can't amend private members' bills. So we found a private member who put it forward as his own. And of course, once it was put forward, it was very plain sailing. It was a fairly short bill, which simply said that on the recommendation of the Spoliation Advisory Panel, institutions may return cultural objects. It didn't force them to, but I think the moral pressure is quite substantial. And so it would be a very brave institution, perhaps foolhardy one, that said no, they're not going to.
Put them in a box.
Thank you, Jerry. We can start our discussion because I think there are some very interesting aspects to this. One of the things that I recall hearing, and I don't think it was in these videos, but there was a time before the war started when Nazism had overtaken Germany, that Hitler visited Mussolini. And it was his first time in Italy. And he saw for the first time the magnificent works of the Italian art and Renaissance. And he was so struck and taken by that. You know, he just immediately felt, and of course, with his own background of having attempted to be an artist himself and with no success, that he just coveted. And for me, this is very meaningful as to how this led to the special kind of Jewish targeting. Obviously, these families had means, they had culture, they had insights, and they had stuff. So let me ask, was it the art wealth or culture or both? What was it that Hitler or Nazis coveted? I'll open it out to all of us. Please just speak up.
I don't know that we'll ever really know, but it would seem that might with Hitler and the type of personality he has, it was owning something. It was, I personally think he was jealous of the Jews. They were very, very bright people. They were educated. They collected art, not just to collect art, because of the beauty of the art and the understanding of the art. And he couldn't stand that. But if he took it away, and maybe he thought it was going to, it certainly would be going to inflate his ego that he had it. I mean, I don't know. I couldn't study his mind, but it would seem to me, I don't think it had value monetary to him necessarily. It's just that the Jews couldn't have it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead. Please continue, or anybody else.
No.
Andre, are you muted?
Yes, it is.
Yes. You're muted. You're still muted.
Unmuted. There we go. Unmuted. Okay.
Okay.
Well, there's a little bit of background I could just talk about with my father with this thing is, we got to remember that Hitler was very involved in the culture of Vienna before and after the First World War. In fact, he applied to be in the Art Institute in Vienna to be, art school. And it was actually, he was rejected. But my father actually around the same time got into that school, which is ironic. Okay, but that's neither here nor there. What's important is to understand that people like going to listen to music like Gustav Mahler conducted at the opera. Hitler knew all that. He knew the prestige of all that. He knew what it meant. It was definitely, and they thought they didn't want to taint it with the Jewish. They were Hitler was very interested in making cultural hay out of everything. He wanted to advance things like Wagner's music or Anton Bruckner, even composers who weren't anti-Semitic. He would make them, these kind of Nazi sympathizers. That's one thing. The second thing is that, I wanted to also point this out. You're talking about the 30s. When the Nazis came in, when Hitler came into power, not really where they took over Germany, there was also a concerted effort in Germany to get German works of art that they liked in their collections and get rid of a lot of things like impressionist paintings, which they didn't like. Because there's a painting by Renoir of San Marco, which is now, it's a very colorful painting, and it's in the Minneapolis Art Institute. And I know that my father traded a German painting to the German government to get that out of Germany, and then it was sold in America. So there was a lot of that going on. Other thing we have to remember with all this story is a lot of paintings, very valuable paintings from families who owned them, Jewish and not, were not only in their homes, they were in vaults unstretched in Switzerland. A lot of contention about those who owned them. Were they transferred over to Nazis for those kind of, you're going to get a ticket out of the country? There was a lot of negotiations, odd negotiations going on. And they're hard to trace. In the future, they're very hard, but they're doing a good job now. They're finding out, who owned these things and who didn't. The other last little point I was going to say is my father was a guy who was hired by the American government to go to Europe after the war, but his function was more in authenticating that they were real paintings, that they were part of, he was called by the government to do a lot of that throughout his life. So it was more involved with that than anything else. But you got to remember, Goering was involved. These people very much wanted cultural stuff to them, to the Nazis and to Hitler, was power. It's part of having power. And they wanted to create a whole new view where this whole modern art movement was all sick Jewish stuff, and the pure stuff was like maybe more going to Italian Renaissance models and kind of Hellenistic stuff. So they wanted to create this whole view, which they thought was going to be the view for the future.
I want to ask you if this might be akin to the kind of nationalism that we're dealing with today.
Very much so.
What is correct, what is proper, what should be put on top? Anybody want to respond to that? Yes, go ahead. Yes.
I think, the theme of nationalism, and to kind of expand a little bit on what Andre just mentioned, the idea of Nazi domination of art and music and acquisition of possessions. There was a counterpoint between things that were considered appropriate for Germans to view in the late 1930s, and works which were stolen and held for value and domination. So there was nationalism, and then there was domination and acquisition of wealth going on. This extended really across, all media, including burgeoning film, where propaganda was the primary purpose. The Olympics of 1936 was another example used to try to establish that domination and strong sense of nationalism. And I think to get to your question, Abraham, about nationalism and in the US, you certainly have movements here and just kind of dealing with the artistic and iconic aspects about, do you purify history? Do you remove monuments of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis in the interests of ostensibly righting a wrong, even though these are unfortunate parts and very devastating parts of our history? So there are similarities on a certainly less grand scale and less dominating scale, but they are certainly there.
So how do we feel about this? It's been a long history, contentious. There are still many institutions that, they have legalism behind them. We saw that in the last video. We can't, do anything about this. That the moral aspect is, is not for them to judge it, but others accept it and willing to lose lots of money to do the right thing. Anyone? Yes, Judy.
Well, I think that I'm sorry, I haven't watched the whole series, but I'm sure everyone knows the story of A Woman in Gold and how that painting came eventually to where it is now. But the presence of that painting, when we're in New York, no matter what, brings hundreds of thousands of people to see that painting. And they have at the same time the story written there of this painting. And I think that for everyone that we don't return to their rightful owners, if we can get them into public places where the story is being told, it will be passed down, just as the Holocaust Museum does that in one way. We need to do that in art. We need to do that in film. We need to do that in theater. We need to have the stories told. The Neue Gallery had an exhibition on all the art that was prohibited by Hitler, and they had brought a lot together. It had an enormous amount of people coming to that show. Granted, it was in New York, but we need to travel these kind of shows to other places, be it Germany or other countries, so that the story stays alive in the art. Because unlike anything else, there's a permanence to this art. And as people think, my father died, he can't tell his stories anymore. As Andre can tell his father's, I can tell mine. But as you go down the generations, but the stories of the art is one of the vehicles by which we can continue the transmission of the story in public places. So my hope is that we have more people who do reclaim and put in public spaces the story, and that more people start to see the story and therefore the danger of what happens.
I noticed in the chat that Lauren said that she's not familiar with the Woman in Gold story. I advise you to just go on Netflix, and I'm sure you can find Woman in Gold, and it is a wonderful story. Please view it if you haven't. Louise, you're muted.
What I'm curious about is, after so many years of resisting acknowledging that these were stolen pieces of art, what turned the museums around? Because they fought this for years and years, and it seems that it was fairly recently that they started feeling a moral consciousness to return things. So I don't know if Andre can answer that or someone else.
Yes, you're muted, Andre.
The only thing I would say is bad is the press. It's bad. Museums, what's very important to them is their public relations. You know, they're supported by people who come to the museum. If they get a very bad reputation, it really affects the museum.
Yeah.
It really affects donors to that museum in the future. So it gets a very bad reputation and then it's goodbye. The only thing I wanted to say, I mean, we're talking, it's interesting talk, but we have to remember one of the great damning of the whole Hitler system and the whole Nazi system involved with culture is nobody remembers all those lousy Nazi painters. There's not one, nobody likes those paintings anymore. The greatest victory we have is for all these modernist paintings that were called degenerate, now going up for sale at, you know, Sotheby's at Park Bernay and whatever, and they're selling for, you know, $70 million. So, I mean, we won that war, you know.
Thank you, Andre. So, now I think I'm still struggling with how can I see into Hitler's mind? I mean, what made him so hateful and coveting and, you know, planning a museum, you know, even before he did all the thefts and even before he did all the murders, he was planning all this for a long time. And this, I mean, how bad can it get? I mean, that's, you know, very calculating. Any reactions to that?
Trump's been planning for a long time too. And I think that, you know, when Trump first announced, my dad opened the door to his apartment and he said, he's going to win. I mean, he grew up in Nazi Germany. He said he's going to win because America wants him now and he's there now. And my husband was, oh, no, there's no way this is going to happen. And my dad said, no, this is going to happen because America wants this now. And I think, Abraham, your answer is right here in our own country. It's not just there in the history, is what plants the seed of such deep hatred and such deep discrimination that you take any form possible to remove the rights of those who you find you hate for whatever reason deep down. It's such deep hatred. And you have to have enough people who are going to go along with it. The saying about Nazi Germany, my son was more of a historian of it. That was his area of expertise. If one thing had been different, it wouldn't have happened. One thing.
Wow.
It had to all come together. And part of that came together was, you know, Henry Ford helped the situation. They didn't know who was going to win the war. I mean, you go back in history, the United States hands are not all clean. And if one thing had been different, so I think the message to us is we have to make sure that one thing is always different here. And so it can't take root the same way. But Trump is still here and the Republicans are gaining. And I wake up in the morning and I say to my husband, I don't want to talk about it because it makes me sick. But every time I hear voter rights being suppressed, and every time I see we're losing a seat and there's redistricting, Hitler rose and went to jail. He was in jail and he came out and triumphed. Even if Trump is down now, he's not gone, folks. And he's got that support. So we have to keep trying to make one thing different.
So we had that same situation here in our household, and I lost $5 to Sharon. Sharon too said Trump was going to win very early.
Study history.
Well,
but
yes,
know,
Andre.
I just quickly wanted to say the parallel is with Trump is very true, but what strikes me the most, like Abraham's asking, why have Hitler so involved with this art world and everything? all these people, Trump, Hitler's, these kind of people, they view themselves as victims. They play this victim card constantly. We don't understand it. We say, how could you think he's a victim? You're so in charge and stuff like that. Hitler thought he was a complete victim. He was put upon. The only reason he didn't get into art school were those Jewish teachers, were those Jewish art critics, was the whole thing. That was his whole point of view. And that thing burned. That was not a little thing for him. It was a very, very, very big thing. I'm going to get back at them. I'm going to get back at them.
Yes, Maxine, you're muted.
Two things. To Judy's point where she said the US was not blameless in that war, I urge anybody, if they haven't watched, two programs on PBS. One is called America Crossing, and the other is called World on Fire. Both of them are excellent shows. They're streaming now, and Atlantic Crossing will tell you a lot about FDR that somehow I missed in my history lessons, but yeah, he wasn't quite our friend. He wasn't quite our friend. But my other point is, about a week ago, Rabbi Volpe, if anybody knows Rabbi Volpe, he actually produces puts a lot of stuff out on Facebook, but it was during Holocaust Remembrance Day, I think it was. And it says, and he did something called, Why Do Some People Hate Jews? Because we know that that's kind of the view that there are of us. I think, I don't know whether Hitler stole the art because he hated the Jews, but I still, he wanted it for himself. But one of the things he said is hatred of Jews is the most intractable, sustained hatred in human history. Mm-hmm. Moreover, it is a hatred for which reasons have been given by the haters, all of them demonstrably untrue. Jews have been hated when they were poor and when they were rich, when they were communists and when they were capitalists, when they were stateless and when they had a state, when they were religious and when they were secular, when they were invaded and took jobs and when they were rootless and barred from the marketplace, when they were phenomenal achievers in the world and when they stayed in the study hall and did nothing but learn, even when they were present and offer expulsions and murders, when they no longer lived in the country that still bore hatred for them.
Wow.
I mean, I think that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Because in other words, Jews have been hated because they remained Jews, because they refused in the face of the most furious persecutions to cease being who they were, because they reflected back on the world reality of its own brutality, because as Maurice Samuel once put it, no one loves his alarm clock. And that's the alarm clock ringing in the United States today, no? Going back, it goes around, comes around.
There's a book called Why the Jews, written by actually two rabbis. I forget the names, but they come to the same conclusion as in Why the Jews, saying it is because there is this system that works, of education, of family structure, of remembering a history and a tradition, that there's a kind of solidarity that exists that becomes enviable.
I mean, when I see the stuff in the news this morning where they arrested a young man yesterday for vandalizing some synagogues, I believe it might have been in Westchester, I'm not 100% sure. And the reporter yells to him as he's coming out, "Why did you do it?" And his answer was, "Because I believe in Jesus."
Very famous Jew.
Yeah. It saddens me that so many people don't recognize it. My favorite bumper sticker was, "My leader was a Jewish carpenter." But I think if you in many conversations and through adult ed conversations that I've had with here in another synagogue, I've come to learn that many of my friends who are not Jewish, more of my friends are not Jewish necessarily than are, don't really understand their own religion. Mm-mm. They have a very different view of their own religion, and whether they don't know that Jesus was a Jew or they don't want to admit it. I don't know. I don't know which one it is.
Yeah. It certainly is important to understand history in depth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, how do we conclude this? We're coming towards the end. Is there a way in which to leave this in a positive way?
I'd like to hope that these people who are continuing to look for this art and to identify it and verify it, that it won't end. because I believe one of them said there are many items still out there that have not either made their way to the rightful owners or made their way to a museum in a way that makes it the way it should have been, whether it was donated properly by the family, those families that, got it back and then sold it to the museum. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, it belonged to their families. And I guess my hope is that a couple of years from now, we'll have another discussion, or we'll see another quick whatever, that so many pieces of art were found, whether it's Switzerland in a basement or whatever. But I'm sure there are many people who are afraid to speak up.
Mhm.
I just hope they do.
Anyone else? Yes, Judy, you're muted.
When our son was on an internship in Washington, it was at the time when the slave labor cases were going to be tried among about 13 countries. And he had the good fortune of being able to, he was fluent in German, so he was sent to the archives in Washington and went through boxes and boxes that were just starting to be opened because they were sealed. And so much of our information is sealed, so it will not even be there in our lifetime. We don't have access to it. And he went to Cologne as well. And I really do think that this is going to be ongoing, because part of what our country did in the negotiations at the end of the war was to seal the information. And we don't have all these stories, but there are documents there. And one of the things he was trying to look for was a memo that Henry Ford was in contact with Hitler throughout the war at the same time as he was in contact with FDR. And that's how come our GIs met Ford trucks on the beaches in Normandy. I think the same is going to be true of the art. These Nazis kept records. They kept amazing records. And I was in Vienna when some were just revealed. They had just been found in a cupboard in Vienna that no one had seen before, of what happened to all the Jews of Vienna, all the people who had been looking for them. And all of a sudden, these documents appeared. There are ones that are sealed for 100 years. And as we open each one of those boxes, I think that this history will continue to be revealed. And I think our job is to make sure that our children and our grandchildren, when these are revealed, want to still move forward as we have in trying to reclaim the whole story. And it hasn't been told yet. So Abraham, I don't think we can wrap it up, because I think it's still going to be unwrapping. Physically, right here in the American archives in Washington, they're still sealed, 100-year boxes, and in Cologne.
So they opened in 100 years after the war, is that it? Or
what happened was, at the end of the war, they negotiated what type of information could be revealed when. And so part of the negotiations of all these documents was what was going to be revealed. And at the time of these slave labor cases, we were at a 50-year mark. And so there were just boxes that had not been gone through, and our government wasn't organizing them. They weren't looking at them. They weren't making it so it was easily accessible. You had to go in and go through everything yourself. And there are more boxes in Cologne and in the US that are still sealed. And we don't have a plan, and we never did, of revealing the information that is contained in those boxes. People doing research go in and look and look and look, and they find things, but it was part of how they could rebuild Europe and rebuild Germany by not revealing everything. And so that's why so many Nazis were still in positions in Germany and throughout the world. They didn't reveal a lot. And I am sure that we're going to find a lot of memos between Henry Ford and Hitler and FDR knew. And I'm sure we're going to find out where a lot of the artwork was taken, because they were incredible documenters.
Yeah.
So let us hope that the arc of justice.
Oh, I just want to say,
go ahead.
Reminded me of something that's very true about documents and things, from what I understand. The other thing is, if you want to get art dealers upset about anything, just talk about provenance. You're in a minefield there. You want to get art dealers to go crazy. A catalogue raisonné, is the full catalog with the provenance of all paintings of a given painter. It's a minefield to get those things produced. I mean, the Monet catalog just came out not that long ago. Why? Because nobody wants it down in print. And the shenanigans in the art world, not even talking about tax problems and loopholes in Switzerland, bank accounts and all this stuff. When you bring that up, I once was in a court case, I don't want to get into it, involved with all this. In New York courts, you looked at these judges and they were like, we don't want to touch this at all, because the whole thing will explode. I mean, it's let's put it, it's not the most ethical business in the world, the art world business and the art dealer business. And it's a pretty, a lot of shenanigans there. A lot of secrets people want to keep.
So let us hope.
Yes.
I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of this beautiful day.
You too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Abraham.
Thank you, Abraham.
Thank you.